Welcome everyone to the 16th Five Institute Budget Seminar 2022, Unpacking the Union Budget 2022-23. Over the years, and 16 years is a long time, this seminar has become part of the post-budget economic landscape of the capital and is keenly looked forward to, perhaps, dare I say it, almost as keenly as the budget. So let me welcome our five panelists, Yamini Aiyar, President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, Poonam Gupta, DG NCAER, Pinaki Chakraborty, Director NIPFP, Deepak Mishra, Director and Chief Executive ICRIER, and Nishant Chadha, Fellow and Head Projects, IDF. So we have four economists and one political scientist. And as someone with some claim to some kind of training in economics, of course, many years ago, I must tell you, Yamini, how relieved I was to find out that even though you are from the London School of Economics, your basic training is philosophy and political and social science. Given the inability of economists to see eye to eye with one another, or even come to a conclusion on their own, remember Churchill's cry for a one-handed economist? Because economists are always in the habit of saying, on the one hand, but on the other. So imagine where we'd be if we only had five economists today. But anyway, fortunately we don't. We have four economists and one socio-political scientist, so that should make for a treat for all our viewers. But let me not waste any more time and plunge straight into discussion without further ado. But before I do that, and for the regulars of this seminar, allow me to contribute to your store of trivia associated with this event. So for the first time, but hopefully not for the last, we actually have a husband and wife team, not a team, sorry, representing their respective institutes. Allow me to correct that. But it's over to you, Yamini, to give us your view of the socio-political context in which this year's budget was framed. To what extent was this reflected in the budget and where did it fall short? So it's over to you, Yamini, for 15 minutes. And to the audience, please use your chat box facility to send in your questions because we have a full 45 minutes devoted just for you. Over to you, Yamini.
Thank you, Mythili, for that wonderful introduction and a very warm welcome to all our participants. It turns out that a 16-year-old tradition has now converted into the person who was the youngest member of this tradition until not so long ago has suddenly become the oldest member of this tradition. So, which is me. This is, I think, the fourth year in a row that I've had the privilege of participating in this event. But a lot has changed, not only with the country, but also with the country's leading think tanks, all of whom have seen a really exciting churning with many new directors and heads of institutions. Good traditions are traditions that last through multiple transitions. And it's an absolute pleasure and privilege for me to welcome to this 16th edition of this tradition of debating the union budget, unpacking its nuances, especially to Poonam and Deepak, who are the newest entrants into this tradition. Welcoming back for the second time Pinaki from NIPFP, and joining me and be almost the longest member of this tradition, but I still beat him by a year, Nishant. So very, very warm welcome to all of you. And what's particularly exciting about today is how when I first joined in, there was a quiet giggle amongst all the panelists that perhaps now we won't be accused of being a manel. Now I think we have an equal gender split, a sign that times are changing and changing for the better. So thank you and a very warm welcome to all of you and to our audience. And I hope that this is the last year where we have to do this over Zoom. One of the best parts of this long-standing tradition is that once we've all had the chance to bore you with our presentations, the fun really begins right after, over the course of the questions and answer session, but even more importantly over lunch, where we can squabble with each other and spar in person, face-to-face, and not over Zoom. So hopefully by next year, we'll be all together. With that, let me launch into my remarks for today. Usually, we leave the discussion on the political economy of the budget right to the end. But Mythili rightly said, context matters. And if I may say so, good economics is economics that isn't always managed just by the economists, but economics that recognizes the complexity of the political economy in which policies get implemented. So my role here today is really to frame the context of the conversation and highlight the broader political economy within which the budget has been presented and what this may mean for some of the big policy puzzles and conundrums that we confront. For me, at one, I think there's no getting away from recognizing that the budget was presented. This is the second budget that has been presented against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic and all the many consequences that that placed on our economy and on our society. This is an economy that was slowing down as we entered the pandemic, an economy that crashed in the early part of the pandemic, that slowly began to find its feet and recover in its formal sector, not quite in the informal sector. We can quibble over which alphabet to use to describe the economy. But I think the singular fact that incomes, particularly in the informal economy, have been hurt significantly. There are a number of surveys that tell us both that employment levels, there are still significant scars in the labor market. Income stagnated at about 80% of pre-pandemic levels. The informal economy is hurting. In fact, several surveys point out that several households have gone into debt to be able, particularly at the bottom end of the pyramid, to be able to manage making ends meet. The MSME, the informal MSME sector has been ravaged by the pandemic. All of these are realities that the finance minister had to confront as she scaled, as she had to balance the scales of the budget. A second really important aspect that I don't think gets discussed enough is that consequent to the pandemic, several critical public services, often provided by the government and sometimes provided through the private sector, also saw a significant hit. And many of these public services are crucial to the everyday lives of the bulk of the economy. I'm going to share only one slide because I feel the advantage of that it's always easier to talk rather than have slides, but we don't talk about this fact enough. If you take some of the critical schemes that shape everyday life for the bulk of India, Samagra Shiksha, the scheme for school education, ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Services, Poshan Abhiyan for nutrition, Jal Jeevan Mission, drinking water, the non-COVID parts of National Health Mission, you see a narrative of low government releases, so low releases out of budgeted allocations. Only 40% was released for school education, 53% for Poshan Abhiyan, Jal Jeevan Mission, only 54%. And these numbers are, because of the way in which government budgets are presented, it's difficult scheme by scheme by scheme to get completely comparative numbers. Hence, you see different time periods over here. But the general trend is overall government expenditure on critical schemes was at about 50% less than in pre-pandemic times in terms of its releases. And as a consequence, and apart from monies that were released, actual expenditure was even lower. 27% of the approved budget of the Samagra Shiksha was spent up until November of 2021. 30% out of allocations was spent of the Poshan Abhiyan. 14% of the approved budget and 44% of the monies that were released were spent for Jal Jeevan Mission. 69% of the National Health Mission was spent in 2021. Just to give you a sense of the fact that not only had COVID had a significant impact on day-to-day economic activity, it also significantly impacted government public services. Schools, as all of you know, have been closed more or less for the better part of 2 years. Its impact on learning losses has been significant. Surveys by ICRIER point out, which is the only comparative surveys that we have between what happened before the pandemic, learning levels pre-pandemic and learning levels during the pandemic, tell us that on basic foundational literacy, arithmetic, division, basic arithmetic, reading, comprehension, overall learning losses have been significant. Importantly, a significant number of students that were enrolled in private schools have now re-enrolled into government schools. So overall, enrollment in government schools, in public schooling, has increased by a significant percent, importantly amongst households that were at the richer end of rural India, telling you that there have been significant shifts in the ways in which the average Indian is accessing public services at a time when spending has been low. Relatedly, the Narega spending at the start of the pandemic increased to 1.1 lakh crores. It dropped in its allocations last year to about 73,000 crores, increasing in revised estimates to 98,000 crores. But three things that are really important to remember in the context of Narega, the most critical social safety net that has seen us through the bulk of the pandemic. Number one, demand for Narega work still outstrips demand if you compare it to pre-pandemic levels, an important indicator of the extent to which there is still distress in the rural economy. Number two, even though we saw an increase in allocations for Narega, if you compare the budgeted estimates with the revised estimates, as of the 1st of February, 77 lakh households that wanted work from Narega still hadn't been able to access work, telling you that budgetary allocations at this point in time do not match the overall need for the scheme or demand for the scheme on the ground. Thirdly, when there are delays in when budget allocations outstrip supply, two very important things happen. Number one, work sites get opened, but we see delays in wages. As a consequence, over several years, and this is a trend that has no political, specific political alignment. We saw it from 2012 onwards. There is a delay in wages. As a consequence, pending wages move from one fiscal year to the next. At this moment in time, 10,000 crores of wages are still pending to be given to people who worked. So there are delays, so delays in wages. And the second very important thing is demand rationing. Work sites are not open, which is why you see 77 lakh households who wanted work under Narega not accessing work. So the argument that Narega is a demand-driven scheme and therefore budgetary allocations increase as demand increases doesn't bear out with the reality of how the scheme implements. Another important sign of the context in which the budget was presented, where demand for public services and particularly demand for social safety nets wasn't quite being met by virtue of the funds that were available or the budget or public expenditure that was made available over the pandemic years. It's in this context that the second very crucial context in which the budget was presented needs to be considered. As Ratin Roy has argued often, our macro-fiscal position is one which represents what he calls a silent fiscal crisis, in that the ability of the government to raise resources or to raise revenues per its own expectation of revenues that it wants to raise has been relatively lower than its ability to raise revenues. And as a consequence, public expenditure till the pandemic, Government of India, Union government expenditure as a percentage of GDP had been shrinking. The pandemic changed this a little bit. In 2021-22, consequent to the pandemic, expenditure as a percentage of GDP enhanced significantly to about 17%, actually 17.78% of GDP. The following year, this last year, FY 2021-22, expenditure dropped by 1.5% of GDP. Where did expenditure drop? Expenditure dropped largely in the provision of public services. And if you look overall at centrally sponsored schemes, which is the data that I just showed you, many of the key flagship schemes, those are several of the schemes where we saw a significant drop in expenditure. Over this coming fiscal, as the budget has provided for, we are going to continue to see this drop in expenditure from 17.78% in 2020-21 to 16% in 2021-22 to about 15% in FY 23-22 to 23. So once again, the union government expanded its expenditure at the start of the budget primarily to respond to the health and and social safety net requirements, it has consistently over these last 2 years started decreasing its expenditure, even though this year revenue buoyancy improved somewhat. Its expectations of what it wants to raise from revenue remain somewhat modest, almost too conservative for next year. So essentially, we are seeing budgetary decisions being made, or a macro fiscal position that is now one that is perhaps a little more realistic and conservative, but one that is also an admission by the government of its inability to raise resources to the challenge that it confronts. The challenge of disinvestment has been debated quite widely, and once again, that's an indication of the inability of the center to be able to raise resources per its own requirements. Now, this creates two very important conditions in which budgetary decisions were made for this fiscal. Firstly, the government of India the finance minister then has to make a very difficult choice. Do I balance the need for continued safety net or the palliative aspects of the response to the pandemic, which is essentially what the government did in a large way in the first year of the pandemic, FY 2020 to 2021, where NREGA, food subsidy were the two primary pillars for response. The next year, these were scaled down marginally, but food subsidy continued, and NREGA expenditure remained somewhat elevated, although we know very well, as I mentioned earlier, that elevated expenditure didn't quite meet overall demand for the scheme? Or do I look forward to the choices that I need to make for the economy to get back onto a future growth path? It's very clear in the choices that were made as capital expenditure was increased, which is the big bet that this budget made, that capital expenditure increase took place on the back of a significant reduction in revenue expenditure, particularly welfare spending. So all the critical centrally sponsored schemes have seen some cuts and on occasion nominal increases. And as we go into the Q&A, I'm happy to share specific figures with you. So in some senses, the weak macro fiscal position for the center created for the finance minister a difficult decision. And the decision the finance minister has taken is one where clearly the government thinks that we are past the need for providing the basic palliative care to the economy, which is what had been done primarily in the first year and partially in the second year. And we need to look forward. And in that looking forward, the choice has been very clear that the expenditure focus has to be on big capex. Whether that's the right choice or not, it raises a very interesting political economy puzzle. One of the aspects that is very well recognized of the BJP's politics is a politics that is very much an interesting intermingling of a politics of welfarism and a politics of Hindu nationalism. What we are seeing, and we saw this beginning in the budget last year, at least from the central government's position, is a shift away from a politics of welfarism, more towards a public infrastructure as the key flagship of what the government wants to do. This is very different to what the BJP government did in its first term, where welfarism and flagship schemes were the heart of what the BJP is doing. Why is this? I don't have a good enough answer, but I'm going to present one hypothesis. One of the most interesting aspects of the political economy of the centrally sponsored, of the flagship schemes or the welfarism of BJP in the first year was its ability to access direct political attribution through its flagship schemes that yielded positive electoral outcomes. Over these last few years, state governments too have picked up on this trend. And you see across state governments, many of whom are opposition parties, that for state elections, direct benefit transfers and doles or freebies have become part and parcel of the narrative of state elections. Perhaps an interesting choice is being made. In the run-up to state elections, more welfarism may not be able to give the edge to the party as much as a narrative of big infrastructure, highways, roads, and big investments. It's a question mark, but an interesting shift in the nature and dynamic of the politics of the BJP as of today. Remember, 2017 UP elections saw a lot of discussion on Ujjwala. 2022 UP elections are seeing a lot of discussion on highways and expressways. The second important, and I'll end here, aspect of the political economy dynamic of what the weak central government does is the extent to which the central government then encroaches on state expenditures. This challenge of centrally sponsored schemes, the primary vehicle through which the central government supports states, supports social sector expenditure, and the extent to which this undermines state fiscal freedom has long been debated. The 14th Finance Commission set to correct that. The 15th Finance Commission was attempting to continue in that tradition, saying 41% of devolution to states. But the practice of cesses and surcharges has meant that state share as a percentage of gross tax revenue has remained low. That trend continues today at 29%. Capital expenditure, a big shift with capital expenditure of the 1 lakh crores going to states has been presented as an interesting shift towards deeper fiscal federalism, states taking the center stage on capital expenditure. But I will say, I would argue that the extent of conditionalities been given there essentially means this is it's a sign of increased centralization rather than deeper federalism, and in that sense continues on the political economy track of centralization that has marked the dynamics of center-state relations inconsistently through budgets so far. So overall, and I'll just make my last concluding point, this is a budget that was made under very difficult conditions, where central government expenditure, even though it expanded at the start of the pandemic, has gone down the path of somewhat contraction. Against the backdrop of a contracting budget, of contracting public expenditure, the policy choice that had to be made, more expenditure on the palliatives versus more expenditure on the future. The bet was made for more expenditure on the future, and there too, the bet was made on big infrastructure rather than investments in human capital. The lack of investment in health, which I know Nishant will talk about, is a critical element. The lack of investment in education is another critical element. So less on human capital, more on big infrastructure. A politics that is showing some shift away from welfareism, at least for the moment, towards big, large capital infrastructure politics, investments, and a politics that continues through CapEx, the tradition of deepening centralization. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Yamini. You've put those policy choices very well and put us in the political, social context in which the budget was framed. Thank you very much. And I'm afraid, as you put it, it's not a very happy story so far. So let me turn now to Poonam for the economic context. Poonam, is the story on the macroeconomic scenario, is it any better than the political scenario? Over to you, Poonam.
Sure. Thank you. And Yamini, that was a terrific pitch. I really enjoyed it. And I'll try to not overlap with you. And I'm also mindful of the fact that I have to leave the entire fiscal space to Pinaki. So I'll try to do justice to macro, minus what you said and minus what Pinaki is going to say. So the macroeconomic context of the budget is, as Yamini mentioned, growth has slowed down to 4% during 2019-20. In ongoing research, I'm looking at the slowdown and I have a few explanations, but I won't take the audience time to talk about it. My understanding of the slowdown is a little different from the narratives that we have been reading or hearing about, it being a structural slowdown lasting many years. But that's if there's an interest during the question and answer, I'll get back to it. But more importantly, the slowdown to 4% happened without any apparent shock to the economy. And interestingly, it happened during an environment of macroeconomic stability, which made it an even bigger puzzle. But the implication of the economy being stable in a macroeconomic sense meant that despite low growth, there was some policy space. In fact, there was sufficient policy space to respond to COVID. But very briefly, what do we mean by macroeconomic stability? And so this is a chart that shows growth deceleration to 4%. One more takeaway from this long-term growth chart that I often use in my presentations is that India's average growth rate has accelerated over the last 3 decades. And it has also become more stable in the sense that there are lesser variation around the average. But on to the macroeconomic stability part, when we talk about macroeconomic environment, we talk about inflation. It should be stable, it should be low, and each country can define the level of inflation it's comfortable with. For emerging markets, that number is usually 4 to 5%. So in India, over a period of 3 decades, inflation has declined and it has become more stable. Going into the COVID crisis, inflation was around 5.5%, which can be considered to be a reasonable level for India, which is a large emerging market and still a low middle income country. Current account deficit had also declined and it was in very comfortable range. And in fact, this chart shows that it was turning into a surplus towards the end of the fiscal year. Another variable that we talk about is fiscal deficit, because that determines both the excesses in the economy, whether the economy is living beyond its means, and second, the fiscal space. So if fiscal deficit is anchored, it's again within a comfort zone, then an economy and the government can spend during a crisis. Now, 7% fiscal deficit is considered high, again, for a low middle income country such as India, which is also an emerging market. So when you look at and compare India's fiscal deficit and public debt across countries, and you can choose your comparator group, India stands out as an outlier, both in terms of its level of fiscal deficit and public debt, and that was pre-pandemic. And now it's really off the roof. Non-performing loans and banking sector in general, it took longer for this sector to stabilize, and it was still not completely out of the woods. But the fact that things had started to turn around going into the pandemic meant that there was less to worry about when it came to the stresses in the banking sector. And one can look at the stress and health of the banking sector in multiple ways. Here, I just have non-performing loans because the issues that banks were going through had to do with asset quality. And as we can see, things were not great, but had started to turn around. What this meant was that there was adequate policy room, the economy being macroeconomically stable, though it had decelerated sharply before the pandemic. And then it contracted, as we all know, and we now know these numbers by heart. It contracted by about 7.5% in 2021. And this year, rebound is happening. And this current year, the economy is projected to grow at 9.2%. So there has been a consistent revival of the economy after the first quarter or 2 quarters during the pandemic. Many sectors have actually revived to the pre-pandemic level, which still means 2 years of lost growth. So if the economy has only revived, so on the rightmost bar, we have the gross value added, which is only revived barely to the level that was last seen towards the end of 2019-20, which means that we have lost 2 years of growth. But such was the nature of this crisis. There is one particular segment which is still significantly below the level that was seen 2 years ago, and that's an employment-intensive sector of trades, hotels, hospitality. And it's not surprising that this sector hasn't revived, it being the most contact-intensive sector, and with multiple and repeated restrictions on mobility, this sector is still nearly 8.5% below the level that was seen in 2019-20. Another pocket of weakness is private consumption. So here we can see that most other segments of the GDP have revived, and they are actually have revived quite well. I mean, government consumption is 10% above the level seen earlier. Exports have been a bright spot in the last year or so, 11% above the level seen in 2019-20. But it's private consumption, which is still 3% below the level seen, which means the things absolutely are still not back to normal. So the thrust of the budget, my interpretation was on restoring and accelerating growth. There was certainly more emphasis on infrastructure through higher spending on CapEx, capital expenditure, on logistics, on digital. There was some support given to the MSME sectors and trade and hospitality segments, they still being quite below the level seen 2 years ago. So my interpretation is that while at one level the budget was supporting growth and trying to restore and accelerate growth, it was also mindful of the fact that macroeconomic stability now needs to be restored. So there is nominalization of fiscal policy, which means that revenue expenditures are being taken back to the pre-pandemic levels and rates of growth. And here the assumption is that there are going to be fewer more surprises in the future as far as the pandemic itself is concerned, that the worst is behind us and perhaps there will be no new wave, or if there are new waves, they will be of shorter duration and they will be less disruptive. So my reading of the data is, and of the budget is that there's emphasis to now accelerate growth because it still lags the level seen in 2019-20. The assumption is that the worst of the pandemic is behind us, and therefore one can go back to the pre-pandemic levels of allocations and rates of growth, and therefore this expenditure has tilted towards capital expenditure. Another thing on which the budget is being hailed all around is that its assumptions are reasonable, perhaps not so conservative when you look at the rates of growth of, let's say, nominal GDP in the years before the pandemic. Average is around 11% over a 5-year pre-pandemic period, or when it comes to gross tax revenue of 10.7% of GDP. Again, the number is not very different from what was seen in 4 or 5 years prior to the crisis. So here, I think it seems to be a little bit of risk aversion when it comes to projecting these numbers. And if things go well, then there will be that much room, I guess, to spend. Now, what has happened to the macroeconomic stability in the last 2 years of the crisis? So we entered the crisis in a very strong position, and then there was a very aggressive and very active policy response to the crisis. But let's see what has it done to fiscal deficit, for example. So fiscal deficit is now at a 3-decade high. India was already an outlier going into the crisis when it comes to the level of fiscal deficit, and now it's at even a higher end compared to other countries. Centre's fiscal deficit is still at a very high level, despite some consolidation that has been budgeted in. 6.4% of GDP just for the center, again, is quite unusual and much higher than what we saw prior to the crisis. Debt is again at 3 decades high, and it's going to inch up further next year, and perhaps around to 89% of GDP. And these high numbers have implications, of course, for interest payments. So what constrains government spending capacity is perhaps not so much of just the revenues, tax and non-tax. What is also constraining it very, very significantly is the amount spent on servicing its debt. 5.5% of GDP is spent on interest payments. It's more than the entire capital spending of the center and the states. It's more than their combined expenditure on education and health. So I guess if we are talking about creating more room, generating more room in the finances of the government, then we need to talk about the level of debt and interest payments. This is center's payment for servicing its debt, 3.6% of GDP, much higher than the budgeted 2.9% on capital expenditure. So now the question is, how will this debt be financed? How will the entire financing space be shared between the public sector and the private sector? So we know that tax revenues increase slowly, even with a better tax regime and better administration and compliance. And compressing revenue spending further will be hard. A large part of revenue spending is non-discretionary and sticky. Reducing it further is not feasible. So the only way to square this circle is that non-tax revenues have to increase through privatization and monetization. Another thing is that though government spending on infrastructure is absolutely welcome, it's still very small relative to the private sector's investment numbers and relative to India's need to spend on infrastructure. So government's limited resources may be leveraged better to bring in private sector into infrastructure spending. And I also wonder whether there is scope for more efficiency gain when it comes to debt financing. What I mean by that is the terms on which the debt is being financed. And it's very simple. The debt is being financed primarily through government bonds and through small scale savings. And both of these are relatively expensive instruments. So the rate of interest is 7 to 8%. Borrowing externally is risky, but if the government goes ahead with its borrowing program, there'll be very little left domestically to finance extra investment and extra private sector spending. So perhaps private sector will borrow more externally, or either through equity or debt. Basically, they'll be raising their capital needs more externally. On top of that, the environment is going to be challenging. So therefore, this budget actually had to treat very carefully the demand from various quarters to spend on revenue, on different schemes versus capital expenditure, and still trying to consolidate. And that's exactly the challenge that the budget has tried to navigate. The environment is becoming challenging, both because domestic interest rates are now slightly higher, still within the comfort zone of 4 to 6%, but the global environment is turning around a little bit. So here the global environment is actually a little mixed. Trade outlook is great, and it's a bright spot. But it's being counterweighted by a tightening liquidity outlook. Bank of England has already raised its policy rates twice. Fed is going to follow the suit this year, and even the European Central Bank may tighten as well. And our research shows that the government of India's bond yields co-move very closely with the US bond yields. So if the US tightens its policy rates, there will be implications for India's cost of financing its debt. India, as we all know, is an importer of oil and other commodities. Oil prices have increased by nearly 60% in the last 1 year, and commodity prices have increased by 30%, and they're going to make the policy space a little bit tighter as well. So just to sum up, the budget has tried to achieve a very fine balancing act. As in the past 2 years, from a macroeconomic perspective, I call it to support growth responsibly, where you don't let your fiscal deficit go through the roof to the extent that you can. You keep some space for any kind of contingency. And what you do is that you improve the quality of expenditure, which means that you increase the allocation to capital versus revenue expenditure. And all of this is being done, being cognizant of the fact that we are an emerging market and we do not have the kind of liberty and flexibility that advanced economies have the economies which issue hard currency, which the wider public globally is willing to hold no matter what. Besides, there's only so much that public expenditure can do to support private consumption or growth. Ultimately, growth has to come back and private sector investment has to pick up. And there's only so much that can be announced in the budget. My hope is that more reforms would be announced throughout the year and implementation would also go through as expected. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Poonam, for doing a great job on bringing us up to speed on the macroeconomic context. It's interesting to see that what Yamini sees as a somewhat incomprehensible shift away from welfarism at a time when a large section of the population was suffering, you see as a rationalization of expenditure. I'm sure the audience will want both of you to debate that during the question and answer session. But now let me turn to Pinaki to fill us up on what is perhaps the most important aspect of the budget, the very heart and soul of the budget, the government's receipts and expenditure. Pinaki, why does the government find it so difficult to spend? Yamini also spoke about it. The fiscal deficit was barely 50% of that budgeted for the entire year at the end of December. And government also had a huge cash balance. What is your verdict on government finances? Inefficient, inadequate? Over to you, Pinaki.
Thank you. Thank you, Mythili. Thanks, Yamini. Thanks, Poonam, for very interesting presentations. I'll just share my screen and is it visible? Okay. So I'll try to, have 4 broad sections in terms of, understanding this budget, and would like to show some data, long-term data on fisc to see and try to understand what is happening. It's with a caveat that this is just an indicative kind of an exploratory data analysis, not that I am trying to establish a very robust causal relationship. That's the first part of the presentation, which I will also try to map against various catastrophic and crisis events of India since 1950-51. Then I'll talk very briefly about the fiscal consolidation strategy 2023, key issues and challenges. Then on tax revenue stability and its sustainability, and central transfer to states and CSS. I'll show you some number and then some. So let me start. So if yes.
Do you want to put it in the animation mode so that we can see the full slide? Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so let me show you this major, health related catastrophic events in India. The first one was after independence, of course, Asian influenza, 1957-58. Then that was, the entire India was affected by this, and there are 4.4 million cases and 1,000 plus death. Then we had smallpox, but number of fatality was much higher. Then we had 2019 swine flu and the COVID. And as you can see from the data, the order and scale of COVID catastrophe is not at all comparable with other crises that India faced. So now, as I said, I'm not going to make any causal relationship or anything. This is just data, just to see the trend. Now, if we look at plot these along with other major crises India had, and if we see the government expenditure from 1950-51 to 2022-23 BE budget estimates as a percentage of the GDP, there are 2-3 things that emerge out of this trend. I'm not saying that it's indicative, please understand. It's not that I am drawing a conclusion, but it's indicative. One thing that emerges out of this data analysis, when we look at revenue, total expenditure of the government, that means revenue expenditure plus the capital expenditure, crisis always resulted in sharp increase in expenditure, be it Asian influenzas, Chinese war, drought, smallpox. The only time when there was continuous fiscal expansion was 1974 to 1986-87. And then we started, consolidating. But by that time, it was too late. Then we had the economic crisis of 1990-91. And then if we look at the COVID, global financial crisis, of course, we started consolidating again after 2000, throughout the 90s. And then global financial crisis again resulted in huge increase in fiscal deficit from the level where it was in 2002-3 and 2004-5. Then we consolidate since 2010-11. Then comes COVID, and we have one of the highest level of fiscal deficit in India's history. And then if we look at 21-21, 22-20 RE and 22-23 BE, we see some consolidation happening. And that also is more or less, in line with the kind of consolidation happened when we had other serious macro and other catastrophic events. So that's the broad trend that I see in this data. And revenues, of course, it has increased over time. But if we look at last 70 years data, revenue expenditure of the net to the center. So I'm not talking about the gross tax revenue, because that's what is available with the center to spend. And that, I think, since early 2000, it increased for some period of time, and then it remained at around 9.5, and now it has declined to less than 7.5%, at around 7.5% of GDP. So that's the broad pattern that emerges. And if we plot this against the crisis and the fiscal imbalances, so debt and deficit, we do see that there is major increase in debt and deficit at various crisis period, and we see that we tried consolidating immediately if we look at the historical data, and that's what is being done in 2021-22 RE and 22-23 BE, and we are at a level of debt and deficit. This is only of the center, which is around 60 plus, which is one of the historical highs of India's debt to a high level of debt to GDP ratio, to the extent of to the 60%. And if we add the center's debt to state debt, it will be around 90% of 90%. So that's the kind of number that we get now. Now, what are the discussions post budget? One discussion is should we be having should the budget discuss given a quantified path of the fiscal deficit reduction or versus direction of fiscal correction? And that debate, I think, is very useful, but we need to factor in uncertainties and move towards greater fiscal consolidation. The data that I had shown in the last two slides, I think it's very important that we consolidate and we consolidate fast. In 2000, Poonam mentioned about this. In 2021 RE, the interest payment is 25.7% of revenue expenditure and 39.14% of revenue receipts. So that's very high, and that is probably one of the reasons why there is very little fiscal space for increasing revenue expenditure on various grants given to the states. And fiscal expansion needs to take into consideration the shrinking primary revenue expenditure space due to the rise in interest payment. Now, this is the data that has already been shown. And now, if we look at the effective rate of interest, I think that's very, very important. Our effective rate of interest, outstanding primary total interest payment divided by last year's debt, it was around 6.74%, declined to 6.5 it started declining in 2021 to 6.65. Now it is again increasing, and our debt ratio is around 60 at states debt to it. So if we don't consolidate, and if we think that since there is a crisis, we can expand without factoring in the need for fiscal consolidation, I think that would actually further reduce fiscal space available on the revenue expenditure side. So that's the second point. Now let me come to the central transfers and to states and union budget. Now there has been a lot of discussions about what happened to the transfer post-COVID. And if we look at aggregate transfer, it shows as a percentage of GDP a marginal increase from 2019-20, but this does 6.39 to 6.80. That's because the taxes have contracted, so the tax devolution has fallen sharply. So and the increase in grant could not really compensate it fully, but overall there is an increase, and total transfers to states, if we look at in 2022-23, it's estimated at 6.80%. That's the story. Now, how do you treat CSS? There are 28 schemes, and there is a large revenue deficit at the central level. And center is essentially borrowing and giving grants to the states. Now such a financing pattern beyond a point has its is not sustainable. So if we look at share of CSS in revenue deficit, so share of CSS in revenue deficit was 60% in 15-16. 16-17, 76.27%. In 2021, because there was a large increase in revenue deficit, so this declined to 26.49%. But in terms of volume, it was larger than 15-16. And it's again started in increasing if we look at 2021-22 RE and 22-23 BE. So when we talk about CSS and scheme-specific allocations, I think we need to also talk about CSS as a macro fiscal imbalance issue. It's not only about scheme X or scheme Y. I think the fiscal space available for greater CSS is very, very limited. Secondly, more and more CSS means tying up state resources, because these are central programs, and since states have to make 40% matching contribution for this CSS, so actually states revenue deficit also goes up. So I think it's important to spend on CSS. There has been substantial rationalization of CSS in the last couple of years, but I think we also need to rationalize it further and see what is optimally possible. So CSS in itself is not bad, but too many CSS is certainly not a great idea, because it's increased. It has serious macro fiscal implications, and successive finance commissions have talked about it. So this is the pre-COVID, post-COVID kind of an analysis, and it does not take into account the extra borrowing power given to the states in the year 2021. So if we take that into consideration, I think overall resource flow to the state will be higher than 6.86, because borrowing provides you extra fiscal space for borrowing. But if you look at states' budget, I haven't put that data in this. The states have budgeted their fiscal deficit at 4.4 in 2021 and 21-22 at 3.8. So this entire fiscal space that is available with the states is not fully utilized. So there is still time. So if it happens, I think government expenditure will increase even in this year. So and this is the point that both Yamini and Poonam mentioned. The tax buoyancy for the pre-pandemic period from 11-12 to 19-20 is less than unity. The growth of gross tax revenue is budgeted at 9.6% over 21-22 RE. So tax growth, I also feel, is conservative, given that GST has improved and direct taxes are buoyant. And I just did a quick calculation. If taxes grow at the rate of 11.1%, there's a GDP growth assumption. So I am assuming unit elasticity for taxes, the fiscal deficit can be reduced from 6.4 as it in 2023 to 6.25% of GDP. So if the taxes grow at unit elasticity, I think there will be some fiscal space available for higher spending. So conclude, there's been 46.8% increase in union government expenditure between 1920, that means pre-pandemic, and 22-23 BE, from 27 lakh crore to 39 lakh crore. That's quite a significant amount. And the tax devolution shows an increase of rupees 79,000 crore in 21-22 RE compared to the BE of the same year. So the issue of cash surplus that we are talking, we are reading in newspaper has probably got to do with this as well. So higher borrowing, higher cash flow in terms of tax devolution, actually creating a kind of spending pressure on the states, because there is the fund flow is significant. I think that's important to know. Though fiscal story is in the budget is about supporting the recovery through higher capex, direction of fiscal consolidation towards deficit reduction and overall debt is absolutely critical given the rising effective cost of borrowing and high debt to GDP ratio. And given the rise in interest cost of debt, and appropriate debt management strategy focused on cost of debt. Actually, we don't talk about debt management much when you talk about aggregate volume of debt. So there are nuances there. So I think may reduce the burden of interest payment in the medium term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pinaki. That was a very interesting insight that you gave about government's finances. And you spoke of the quality and versus the quantity debate in the context of government spending. Also, you emphasized the limited space available to the government. But that really leaves unanswered the question of what can government do, given the fact that the center's finances have implications and spillover effects for state finances. Also, what can the union government do? Can it really abdicate its responsibility to its citizens? But I'll leave that to the question answer session. So for now, let me move over to Deepak. Deepak, Poonam described the trade outlook as bright. Do you share that view? Will the world recovery come to our rescue, or will it pose headwinds by way of higher oil prices, higher commodity prices, capital flight? Is digitization a bright spot in an otherwise fairly bleak scenario? So that with that, it's over to you, Deepak, to shed light on all these issues. Deepak.
Okay, thank you, Mythili. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. And good evening, everyone, including my fellow panelists, dear participants. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be part of this event. I was just checking, apparently this event started when Twitter was launched in 2006. So that tells you the endurance of this event. So I'm really happy that I'm part of this consecutive 16 years of event that has gone through. So exactly 4 years ago, in January 2018, this picture you see on your screen sent a shockwave through the global policymaking circle. It shows the president of China, the Secretary General of Communist Party, Xi Jinping, delivering his annual lecture after the new year. What caught people's attention is not what Xi said, but what was in the bookshelf. The two books that were prominently displayed in his bookshelf were The Master Algorithm and The Augmented Life in the Smart Lane. The fact that the president of China was reading such a techie book was seen as how informative and clued in the Chinese policymakers were. I was in the US at that point, and many of my American friends wondered if their president is not even interested to read the Delhi National Security Brief, how can US compete with China in the era of Industrial Revolution 4.0? I, as an Indian, also wonder whether our leaders will be technically as proficient as the counterparts in China. I'm delighted to say that I didn't have to wait too long. And in fact, this budget delivered quite a lot that I was hoping for. This year's budget should go down in the history as the first budget to mainstream new economy issues in the public discourse. So it's not just the 20-year-olds who are talking about blockchains, non-fungible tokens, crypto assets, CBDCs, but the parents and grandparents too. It's debatable whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but there is no debate that the finance minister has infused a whole set of new vocabulary to the post-budget discourse. The budget laid out 4 priorities, which I'd like to paraphrase slightly as integration, inclusion, investment, and innovation. What FM referred to as the PM Gati Shakti is about creating a highly efficient logistics system in the country to further integrate the domestic market as well as integrate India with the rest of the world. The second pillar, inclusion, or what she called the inclusive development, is about urgently dealing with post-COVID scars, including bridging the learning gap, strengthening the healthcare system, dealing with farmers' plight, connecting every household with pipe water, reviving informal sector, and the MSMEs. The third priority was financing investment, or simply as investment. Here, the budget aims to create a virtuous cycle of infrastructure, investment, employment by boosting public investment, lowering the cost of doing business, and improving the ease of living. And finally, the last priority, which was a mouthful, productivity enhancement, sunrise opportunities, energy transition, and climate action. And this was the most forward-looking part of the budget to strengthen the foundation of the new economy by promoting technology-enabled development, energy transition, and climate change. I believe these 4 I's together perform a pretty decent balancing act of dealing with the immediate imperatives of the post-COVID world, sustaining the growth momentum while keeping an eye on the long-term prize of rapid and inclusive development. So let me get into the budget backdrop. So we heard Poonam mention about the macro situation before the budget. Pinaki talked about the fiscal situation before the budget. So let me talk about, and I'm going to focus only on 2 areas, trade, investment, and digital technology. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of what was happening in this part. So first on the trade, as this picture shows, that India's global integration or integration of the Indian economy with the rest of the world has been one of the fastest, at least among the G20 countries. So here I have only the G20 countries, and it was actually the second fastest except or excluding China, the fastest excluding China. So India's exports have been growing on average about 12% over the last 21 years. Imports at 13%. So India has been having a deficit on trade, but not a massive one. And the China is the reverse. But what's important is India's trade, both imports and exports, are growing twice the rate that which was the average for the G20 countries. And as I said, while India was running a trade deficit, its overall current account deficit was relatively low, except during the taper tantrum years of 2013, and was financed through surplus in service trade and record remittances. But unfortunately, this very interesting story on integration has unraveled in the last few years, and specifically in the post-2008-9 global financial crisis. In recent years, trade has grown slower than GDP, and India has experienced a much faster disintegration, if I can use that word, than most other G20 countries. FDI has been more resilient, but India has never been a huge recipient of FDI if you compare it as a share of GDP, not in absolute term. So clearly, when it comes to trade, the long-term story is very positive, but in the last few years, a lot of the sheen of that story has been taken off. While India has been struggling with the traditional sectors, what's pretty impressive is that it has been doing very well in closing the gap in the new economy sectors. So it took nearly 50 years for India to start electrification since the invention of the electric bulbs by Thomas Edison. Indians use computers after 20 years after the counterparts used it in the West. But interestingly, and it's pretty hard to believe this data, which I think is from pretty authoritative source, shows that there are now more Indians who own crypto assets than the next 9 countries combined. I've never seen, this kind of thing. Crypto was invented in 2008. I don't know how, but this data comes from a source which is also quoted by Mint and others. But even if you take out some of the exaggeration that is there, clearly there are a whole host of Indians who are investing, are aware about this, and are dealing with these issues, which are pretty much esoteric for a large percentage of the population in the world. Second story on the digital. There are 3 Indian cities, Bangalore, Delhi, and Mumbai, who appear in the top 20 cities in the ranking of startup ecosystems. So we've heard a lot about the startups and unicorns and all sorts of things. And what's interesting is in the global ranking, and this is very hard to find in any other sectors, that you would actually find 3 Indian cities in top 20. There are 5 Chinese cities and about 17 American cities in top 50. But nevertheless, it's still a pretty significant achievement for Indian cities to be actually ranked as some of the best place to do startups. And then if we believe that if RBI successfully rolls out the digital currency or digital rupee, India will actually be one of the few G20 countries, mostly after China, to have actually successfully managed to roll it out. These are huge achievements compared to when you think about the traditional sectors like textile or leather products or all sorts of things where India is currently struggling to do it. So in a sense, there is this story about the 2 India economy is very clear when you look at what's happening in the new economy and what's happening in the traditional sector. So this was a very important juxtaposition around which the finance minister has to announce a budget. So I'm not going to talk about the various policies because we all know the policies. So refer to them, and some of them are in my slides for those who are more interested in details. But what are the real implications of this policies? So let's start with the trade. And as Mythili said, while trade might be a bright spot for 2021, 21, 22, because this year we're going to hit $650 billion of trade for both goods and service combined. But when you come to think of the trade policies and what the budget has in store for it, I would say it's a mixed bag. So there are certainly a lot of positive developments. So there's a strong push to multimodal logistics and connectivity. So the Gati Shakti National Master Plan expresses much needed push for altering logistics and transport connectivity from impediment to catalyst, and bodes well for India's export competitiveness. Similarly, there are also measures to enhance exports. There's a discussion about new legislation to replace the SCZ Act in consultation with the states, and a whole slew of easing of doing business 2.0 and qualitative improvement. But what's the part which I feel is slightly disappointing is the fact that the budget talks about providing incentives for local manufacturing through protectionism, in the sense that for many sectors and commodities, duty exemptions have been revoked. As many as 350 custom duty exemptions have been withdrawn. The budget proposed gradual phasing out of concessional rates in capital goods and projects imports and imposition of moderate tariff of 7.5%. In order to revive domestic manufacturing, many duty-related measures have been announced. Duty exemptions have been proposed to be phased out in some sectors such as agriculture produce, chemicals, fabrics, medical devices, drugs and medicines, where there is sufficient domestic capacity. So some of you might have read Arvind Panagaria's op-ed in TOI, where he said, this is otherwise nice budget, this is a blemish, and this is a slippery slope, because once you start going this route, it's very hard to know when to stop, how to stop, and how do you revoke some of these incentive structures? How do you know that this is actually bearing fruits? So this is a fairly difficult thing happening at a time when the world itself is growing more protectionist. So clearly this is not going to bode very well for massive export from India, at least in the short term. But as I said, it's a mixed bag because there are, of course, other things that are adding to the competitiveness. So in a sense, one has to look at the net impact of this. Of course, there is also not a clear pathway to boost manufacturing linked to GVCs. I also wanted to mention that there's very little in terms of encouraging labor force participation, especially female labor force participation, given that we know this is a huge scope for improvement for India. So while this is a mixed bag, I think there's a lot to celebrate when it comes to digital economy. Again, the detailed reforms are there for you to see, but I would say one of the things that this budget has done is, I would call it the platformization of the Indian economy. So you look at every sector and technology and digital technology being used as a horizontal or as a cross-cutting themes across all sectors, whether it's health, whether it's skills, agriculture, service delivery, and there's a whole host. And this is a area where India has already achieved good success. So the public digital platforms that India has built, from Aadhaar to India Stack to financial aggregators, things are actually working. So one obviously can capitalize on this, and seems like the finance minister and the prime minister have obviously pushed this agenda pretty far in the budget. But I would say that while these are important, this needs to be complemented with reforms, and there are whole host of things that needs to come together for all these reforms to deliver on the ground. And here I'll leave you with two things. First is that while the pivot to the new economy is most welcome, but its benefits need to be shared more widely. And that's because the new economy technology tends to be productivity biased, skills biased, and voice biased. This is coming from some global literature that actually shows the firms which are more productive tends to be even better using technology. Skilled workers can use technology better than unskilled workers, and government and large corporates who already have a lot of voice can actually use this to control rather than empower the citizens. So it's very important that when you're thinking of the new economy as a big source of growth for the country, we need to ensure that the analog foundation below the digital economy is stronger, which means much better investment climate, much more focus on skills and education, and much more accountable and transparent governance. So that's kind of one thing. So if India is going to use this, and I think it's a huge opportunity, I think we should ensure that we invest on those analog foundations of the digital economy. The second point I wanted to make was that for the integration story you can think about is the integration within the country, which is the diffusion of ideas and goods and services within the country, and the integration with the rest of the world. I think the budget has done a pretty good job in terms of when you think about integration within the economy for the old economy sectors. So the SMEs and the whole Gati Shakti is actually to provide a level playing field to the MSMEs compared to the large firms. And so in a sense, that's the strongest part of the budget. What is weaker is anchoring or connecting the anchor firms, the large exports to the GVCs. And whereas in the new economy, it's the reverse. Putting out a lot of these interesting ideas, whether it's about CBDC, whether it's about taxing NFTs, and having laws which will actually take India at par to the global frontier. So the integration with the rest of the world would happen very quickly. What's needed is to focus on making sure that the rest of the India actually benefits faster or more from this benefit. So the whole issue of digital divide and other things becomes very prominent. I think there's a lot in the budget, but if you look at the proportion, the new economy has a stronger focus on connecting India to the rest of the world, whereas the old economy is more about this. So in a sense, that's the complementary part of the reforms that needs to be done. So let me end by saying that the budget was rightly praised for not engaging in financial juggleries. It uses conservative projections, eschews populism and patronage, and took clear stand on very difficult issues. So I think these are really important progress in the reform. When it comes to trade, I felt like there's a lot more strength on domestic integration, but much weaker on global integration. But finally, I feel that if this budget is ever remembered, it will be most remembered for making the new economy so center stage. It will be perhaps the most enduring legacy of the finance minister, that she laid the foundation of a new and promising economy in India. But success is neither automatic nor assured. Implementation has and will remain India's Achilles heel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Deepak. You've touched on a very, very important aspect of Indian scenario, political economy, everything. Saying implementation has always been our weak spot. But you've given a thumbs up to many aspects of the budget. And I'm sure some of your co-panelists and perhaps some of our viewers also might want to quiz you on that a little later. But since we're running much behind time, let me turn the floor over to Nishant to fill us in on the social infrastructure. Nishant.
Thanks, Mythili. I have a difficult job now after Deepak's fantastic presentation, but I'll try my best. So as Mythili said, I'm going to talk about the budget from a social sector perspective. And this is the fourth time I am doing this, and I've always titled my talk Human Capital, because to me, most of the expenditure items that the budget calls the social sector expenditure are actually investments into one of the most important resources that we have, especially in the context of the economy that Deepak was talking about, right? Because the only resource there is people. There isn't much in terms of other things that you need to make sure that you can gain the benefits of that economy. So I'm going to keep doing that and maintain that here as well. I'll do it slightly differently though. I actually do like the budget. I like the budget from the social sector perspective as well. So hopefully, let me see if I can convey why I like that. I'm not too disappointed with it. So, well, the first thing is, as Yamini pointed out, and others too, and you know, a lot of publications and commentators called this sort of the short shrift to the social sector and very fanciful and colorful names for the budget. And if you look at the budgeted estimates for this year compared to what we actually ended up spending last year, the revised estimates, that's true. So I've got on the screen, we have fertilizer, food, petroleum subsidies, and the outlay for the MG and REGS. And there's a significant reduction in all of these outlays. But that is not surprising, because 2021-22 was not a normal year. As far as the revised estimates are concerned, it was not a normal year. Because this time last year, when we did this, we had the similar numbers to talk about, because rightly or wrongly, turned out wrongly, but at that time, the finance minister assumed that there would be no more shocks to the economy as we are doing right now. There are no more health shocks. And so there is, compared to that, therefore, compared to the revised estimates, the budget estimates do appear a little bit low. But if you actually look at what we did in 2019-20, which was the last budget before the pandemic, the budget estimates for this year have maintained significant increases in the subsidies. So for example, the food subsidy is still about twice what we spent on in the 2019-20 actuals. So it's not as if the budget has decided that we are, both the economy and the health setup is completely out of the pandemic. But we can quibble about whether it should be 5% higher or 5% lower. But I think, a 90% increase, even in nominal, even in real terms, is a substantial sort of nod to the fact that food subsidies might be required to be high for a while. The MG and REGS budget, of course, is marginally lower in real terms compared to the 2019-20 actuals. Again, I'm not too concerned about that, because I think Yamini knows this is something I keep talking about when I talk about the NREGS. I'm going to slightly repeat that again this time. I think when we talk about the NREGS, we sort of seem to have given up that the only way employment can be provided in rural areas is through NREGS jobs. I find that a little bit problematic as an assumption going forward, and this is what I mean, right? NREGS creates it's a employment guarantee scheme. I would call it an unemployment insurance scheme, but it does give out, you have to work to get benefits under it. So suppose the outlay for the NREGS, I'm going to do a back of the envelope calculation. This is there is nothing, no analysis in this. This is very simple 5-minute calculation that I just did to convince myself that things are not as bad as they seem. So the NREGS outlay is, if it was 100,000 crores, which would be about 27,000 crores higher than what is budgeted for this year. 60% of this would go to wages at least, because the NREGS wages to capital ratio has to be at least 60 to 40. And so that is about 16,200 crores additional in wages that would have flown to the rural poor, right? But what did we end up doing? Part of it is part of everything, all these budgets and the borrowing is going to a massive increase in infrastructure outlay, right? So this is the increase. I'm not talking about the total infrastructure outlay, right? So there's a 200,000 crore increase from the center, and then there's a 1 lakh crore easy available loans that the states can avail of. I did some digging around, and in 2018, according to some project management reports, 10% of construction cost for a road project is wages. And that means that if you're able to spend all of this 300,000 crores within the year as is being planned, we pay out about 30,000 crore in wages. Even if we do about half of it, we still pay out about 15,000 crores in wages, which is similar to what the enhanced NREGA outlay of 100,000 crores would, or 1 lakh crores would have would have resulted in as wages being flowing to the poor people. Now, my sense is, I haven't done any work on this and I haven't seen any study on this, but my sense is that the people who look, the same people who look for, who work under NREGA and look for employment there are the ones who probably also work on construction sites in the public works otherwise as well, right? So it's not as if the only jobs that are being created are through NREGS, because similar jobs, very similar jobs are directly created by increased infrastructure spending, regardless of the fact that we consider it to be an investment, right? So we harp so much on the capex that we forget that to create infrastructure, direct jobs are created, right? So, so that is something that I think we shouldn't be, 30,000 crores is not a bad outflow in terms of wages. So that's one of the reasons why I don't think it's a completely bad thing. The other reason I don't think it's a completely bad thing is because increasing demand for MG and REGA is a structural problem that we have. So what I've done here is for each calendar month of the year for the last decade, I've plotted the household demand for MG and REGA. Now, of course, it's a slightly messy graph. I'm going to present a clearer one, but the point that I'm making here is that the NREGS demand has continuously increased over the last decade on an average, irrespective of what the growth rate of the economy was, and has outpaced the growth of the rural population. So it's not coming from the fact that the rural population is increasing. It's actually an increasing dependence of the rural poor on the NREGS, right? So there's something that we are not getting correct, because this is a transfer. It's a transfer because it also seems that there are no significant productivity increases in rural areas either. So whatever assets are being created don't seem to be resulting in any, they make lives easy if they are being constructed, but they don't necessarily translate to productivity benefits. Now, a cleaner version is here where we replace the years before 2019 with an average, which I'm calling the pre-pandemic mean. And you can see that the 2019 demand was higher without COVID. The 2020, the first 3 months without COVID, was actually marginally higher than 2019. 2021 and then April 2020 onwards, of course, is a different story, right? So that's the problem that we are facing. We have a structural problem with NREGA demand. The rural economy is not being able to create the kind of employment opportunities or entrepreneurship opportunities that we would need to get people to stop depending on NREGS. And another manifestation of this problem, is the migrant movements that we observed, the kind that we were faced with in 2020. Now, so we've been doing some work in IDF around using some high frequency data to understand migrant movements in the economy. So this is just one graph from that work. So what we have is we use the Facebook mobility data between districts of the country to understand migrant movements, right? So on the top panel, what we have in this graph is, think of it as average monthly movements between districts from May 2020 to September 2021, right? This is the whole country. And you'll see that during the initial months, that is May 2020, July to almost September, during the lockdown and the early lockdown phases, mobility is low. It starts increasing. And then again, in the second wave, the months of April, May, June, it falls, right? It's lowest in the May of 2021. So, it's not unexpected when the virus is around, even without any significant lockdowns, because inter-district movements during the second COVID wave were not stopped. Even public transport was available to the extent possible. So people stopped moving themselves, right? So that's a rational thing to do. You don't want to contract the virus, plus there is no economic activity taking place anyway. But the second panel tries to understand what happens to migrants, how are migrants moving, right? Now, we can't do this directly because we cannot see who's a migrant in the data. In fact, we can't see people in the data. We have aggregate mobility data. So what we can do, however, is we said, fine, let's look at districts which are connected through migration, which are more connected through migration than other pairs of districts, right? And on those, what happens is the complete opposite. You actually see people moving between districts which are heavily connected through migration at the very same time when nobody else is moving. And the direction is interesting too, because they move in the direction opposite to migration. What I mean by that is, if Mumbai has more migrants on the net from Ratnagiri, you see movement from Mumbai to Ratnagiri, not in the opposite direction, right? So these are migrants who are moving back, okay? And so not only is the dependence of the, and this is from urban to rural areas, if you do that breakup. So it's not just the demand for NREGS is high. There's also a lot of dependence of the rural areas, especially in certain states of the country, on remittances. And therefore, I think, the solution to the rural distress that we see is not going to come entirely from rural areas. It can't. And it has to come from creating city-like jobs. It has to come from creating better and more cities. And that, therefore, to me, the emphasis on urban development in this budget is, I'm quite happy with it. The urban development outlay has also increased. We've tried that in the past too. I'm not saying we've not done this, but there is at least an emphasis and an acknowledgement that cities are sort of the future, which we should be looking at carefully. So that is, again, one thing, as I said, I like. Now, what we need, therefore, is investment into people's productivities. We need investments into their education and skills, because India has a very unprepared labor force. Deepak talked about all of those nice things where people owning cryptos, and he talked about the twin, sort of the dual economy in the country. As of 2016, I've not analyzed the PLFS after, but the last time I looked at the data, around 30% of India's labor force is, sort of 28% is illiterate. It's not about having low levels of education. It is not illiterate at all, right? And then you have about barely 12 to 13% which have finished school. Now that's not a population that can take part in any sort of digital economy ventures that you think of. So I think that there is a huge problem that we have. Again, it's a structural problem. We are not trying to solve it as a structural problem. Now, so let me just quickly go through the numbers just to make the context. On education, the outlays are considerably higher. So if you look at school education, for example, between the budget estimates this year and the budget estimates of last year, there is a healthy 15.5% nominal increase, so about 10.5% or so real increase on school expenditure. Compared to the revised estimates of last year, that increase is about 16%, 16 to 17%. And I think there therein lies the rub. We are unable, consistently year on year, we are unable to spend the money that we make provision for on education. Higher education is a similar story. This I've talked about earlier. The one thing that this government has done is increase the higher education outlays substantially at the beginning of the first term, and then sort of maintain those. Health seems to be a different story. So the health budgeted expenditures this year are actually quite similar to the revised estimates from last year, but that's because on account of the second wave, the revised estimates were quite high compared to the budget estimates from last year on health. The interesting thing is the way the spending is done. So it's the same sort of numerically overall, but it has a substantial outlay on capital expenditure in health rather than the revenue expenditure, which I again think is a good thing. I think outlays on capital expenditure at a time you're not expecting something emergent on the health front is a good idea. So that brings me to I'll end with this, the last thing that I want to talk about. And I think that is that our analysis of the social sector budgets, we really need to expand that. We really need to think of it differently. Because education and health are state subjects. And this came up repeatedly, even Pinaki talked about it. By increase, where will the central government spend money on? And we have to ask ourselves that question, where should it spend money on? And my answer to that would be that given that these are state subjects, the central government should be spending money on those public goods which are national level public goods, which means that they have benefits that are not restricted to sort of state boundaries, and therefore states will not have enough incentives to invest in those. The immediate things that come to mind, for example, is technology. Right? If technologies and that DESH platform is for skilling, and there's an alternative PM eVidya platform, and there are others too in education that are being imagined, those should be done by the center because those are national level public goods. Platforms can't be built. Each state can't have a competing platform. These require scale to be effective. So I think those are national level public goods, should be done by the central government. Similarly, R&D, experimentation in both technology and pedagogy, I again think it has huge spillovers, is best done by the national government because they can internalize the externalities. The last thing which we don't often talk about is coordination. We talk about, whenever the budget comes out, we talk about a 6% spend that the NEP has planned. Where will we spend 6% on? Our government schools are emptying out. So the probability of, if you're a government student school today, the probability that you will be in a government school next year is, or not be in a government school next year is 1 in 10. So 10% of our students before the pandemic, that is, moved out of government schools into private schools. And I'm pretty sure that once these 2, 3, 4 year gap is done and private schools start again, the same thing will happen. We'll see a massive outflow to private schools. We have been seeing that throughout. And this is NSS data. So we have our schools are emptying out. We have a problem retaining, essentially we have a problem retaining customers. If this is a business, it would shut down. We don't have customers. Number one. Number two is that we forget that India doesn't spend 3% only on GDP. We have a massive private investment in education. We spend considerably more on the GDP than 3% in terms of on education. So when the NEP and we want the government expenditure to be 6%, we are really talking about a 10 to 11% expenditure on education as a whole out of GDP. That's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. So we really need to be realistic as to having a plan for educational and I think that is where what I've been consistently saying, and that is where I think the budget, all of these budgets lack, is that there needs to be a spending plan for social infrastructure, just like we have an investment plan for physical infrastructure, because without that, we are just sort of running this as a year-on-year thing, and it's not going to work. So I'm going to stop there. Any questions, I'll come to later. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishant, for turning our attention to an area that is often neglected, sadly so, social infrastructure. It's good to know also that you feel the budget this year has done better on that front. Always good to end on an optimistic note. So you've also pointed out how government is often unable to spend the money that it allocates. Well, that brings us to the end of 5 excellent presentations. And I'm very tempted to rather misuse my position as a moderator and ask the first question. But we received close to 850 registrations. In fact, congratulations to all the 5 participating institutions for keeping interest in the budget so high, almost a week after the budget itself. So I will not succumb to temptation at the moment and turn over to the audience questions. So let me start with the first that I have got from Harish Damodaran. And I think this is addressed to Pinaki, though he doesn't specify. He says, what is the reason for government maintaining such high cash balances? Is it that we are overestimating government's ability to spend and underestimating tax revenues? Pinaki?
Thank you. I think when we are talking about cash surplus, we are talking about states. And if we look at this accumulation
Pinaki,
of
let me
cash
just interrupt you
surplus,
there. It is not just states, it's even the center. The union government also had substantial cash balances, both at the end of last year fiscal as well as this fiscal also, if you go to go by the budget. So why should the government, which is borrowing so much, have a cash balance at all, a surplus cash balance?
Center's fiscal deficit in the month of November was, I haven't looked at December, January data, was only 64% of the fiscal deficit. So where is the cash balance? So I'm talking about cash balances at the state level. And if we look at the cash balances and if we look at the history of cash balances, I think it's a precautionary measure. Center can always borrow, states cannot. So there is a limit to their borrowing, and next year they are getting into the 3% fiscal deficit target provided by the Finance Commission, 15th Finance Commission. So and if we look at the history of cash surplus after the global financial crisis, also up to 2014-15, there was huge accumulation of cash surpluses by big states. So they were borrowing, but their cash surplus was huge. I think that is where the fiscal space lies. It's not inability to spend. I don't think I haven't looked at it, but my sense is it is a precautionary motive, because if when there is a limit to borrowing, certainly that would you would like to hold on to reserves if you have to spend more money in the next fiscal. But cash balances disappeared after 14, 15, 16 from the state budgets, but it again is showing up. I think it's a precautionary measures, but there can be other reasons.
Next question is from Kanupriya, and I think perhaps this could be answered by Poonam, but others are welcome to join in if they wish. The question is that, will the budget prove stagflationary thanks to the focus on capex and neglect of boosting private consumption demand? So it seems to fall within Poonam's area, but anybody else who wants to kind of pitch in is welcome to. Poonam.
Right. So stagflation, for those who are wondering what it means high inflation combined with low growth. So there is only so much, as I said on my last slide, that the budget can do when it comes to whether pushing for growth or, for that matter, inflation. But I think if I just paraphrase this question and ask, what is the inflation going to be like going forward, and what is the growth rate going to be like going forward? So my sense is that there is now some tolerance for inflation to exceed 5%, still remaining within the inflation targeting band. And I think that's the outcome we are going to be seeing, 5.5% of inflation. Growth, my best guess of growth is 5 pre-COVID years, minus 2019-20, so 7%. So that is hardly a stagflationary scenario. And as I said, there is very limited influence that the budget can have on any of these two indicators. Government consumption and government investment, in terms of their size, pale when compared to private investment and private consumption. So I doubt that we are going to be seeing a stagflationary phenomenon in the next year or two.
Thank you for that answer. Does anybody else want to pitch in? Any of the other panelists? What is your view? Do you feel that we're heading for stagflationary growth? Okay, well, if there isn't anybody else wanting to pitch in, let me move to the next question. It's from Poonam Gupta of NCAER. And I think this is perhaps falls squarely in Deepak's domain, but anybody else, as I said, any other panelist is welcome to jump in. Her question is that will the electronics industry be able to achieve their target of US dollars 300 billion by 2026, given that customs duties on many of the input items are fairly high, making the products highly uncompetitive? Every budget talks about rationalizing customs duty, reversing the inverse duty, etc., structure, etc., but still rates remain very high. So Deepak, your answer, will the electronics industry be able to reach that target? And what is your take on the PLI scheme for electronics? Deepak.
Thanks, Poonam Munjal from NCR for this question, because this gives me opportunity to plug in for a paper that we're just going to finish and publish soon called $1 Trillion Trilemma, which is about can India achieve $1 trillion exports by 25-26. And part of that story is the electronics, which is a huge part of it. So I think the question is, can India achieve $300 billion of electronics production? Which if you look at the document, it's about 180 billion for domestic production and 120 billion for exports. I believe that the domestic production is achievable because currently, I mean, it's a very stretched goal, but at this point, India is about 64 billion, take a few billions here and there, around that in production. So going to 180 is very tough. It needs, I think, about 60% growth in a year. But if you look at some countries like Vietnam and others, they have managed to ramp up production of electronics that rapidly. But it, of course, requires few conditions, including the ability to import goods, have ancillaries located within India and all that kind of stuff, which at this point, given the geopolitical situation, is going to be tough. I'm less optimistic about the $120 billion exports to the good for the reason that Poonam mentioned, that the cost may not be competitive to achieve that level of scale. And the paper that we are talking about is actually making an argument as to how you can achieve that with a slightly different trade policy than you're doing. So the bottom line, yes, on the domestic production side, it's a stretch goal, but possible in a very, with lots of emphasis and implementation issues, much harder to achieve the 120 billion export goal. So overall, it's a tough one to reach by 25-26. In terms of PLI, very early to say. I think there has been some good positive signs, but the numbers are, it's hardly been implemented. I think the only one where there's really positive hope is the mobile and smartphone ones, where things are really looking good. And the government has actually been a lot more understanding to the industry needs. The other sectors are looking less promising. So that's what I'll say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak, for answering Poonam's queries and also for plugging about your next forthcoming paper. That was an interesting opportunity so that you didn't let go waste. Okay, Deepak, thank you so much. Well, Yamini, there's a question coming your way from Ankit Suri. She says that he says that you had talked about some conditions for the center's transfers to states. Wants to know what are these conditions? And maybe here Pinaki can also supplement, because finance commissions have always toyed with this. Should you have conditional transfers or should you not? So what is the logic, Yamini? And then after that, maybe Pinaki.
Thanks. I think this gets to the heart of many of the challenges, specifically on on the infrastructure 1 lakh crore, capex 1 lakh crore. We have to wait a little bit to get more details, but the budget speech very clearly suggests that a lot of this is for PM Gati Shakti, which is and it includes supplemental funding for the Gramin Sarak Yojana, for digitization of the economy and so forth. There is a larger challenge, and that challenge has to do precisely with this question of what is the role of the center. How should and shouldn't it incentivize states? And to what extent do conditionalities actually create enabling conditions for spending on what are broadly considered to be national goals? And it gets to the heart of one of the challenges that Nishant highlighted, which is sort of, what should be the role of the center? Is it the job of the center to determine line item wise expenditure, as it often does, and centrally sponsored schemes are notorious for that? Or is it the goal of the center to lay out broad frameworks and enable states to build their trajectories of how they need to spend? We have in our, if you look at the dynamics of our fiscal federal architecture tended much more towards deep centralization across political parties, across governments, 2004 onwards in particular, using centrally sponsored schemes. We impose conditionalities often. Those conditionalities are rarely deliberated upon in dialogue with states. As a consequence, you end up in the classic stage of end of the year rush to move money with conditionalities not being met, or states losing out because these are conditionalities that they may or may not be able to meet with. So while in theory, the idea that these are finances that are ours, we are giving them on in the form of grants and aid to states, therefore we have the right to impose conditionalities as a central government, may make sense that this may infuse performance. I think one has to understand the realities of how expenditure management has taken place in India, and most often these performance incentives tend to be incentives, perverse incentives for bad expenditure and disincentives for expenditure, period. One of the challenges of low spending that we have been talking about has a lot to do with the nature of these performance incentives, and the fact that we don't have an enabling environment to effectively monitor and effectively evaluate the quality of spending to ensure that these performance incentives are actually effectively met and there's transparency around those. So to my mind, in those conditions, what is the most appropriate way to go? There is a huge overlap between center and states. The way in which the center has tried to address this is in terms of expenditure, the center has tended to centralize and impose conditions. We need to break this by creating better sites for coordination. The absence of the Planning Commission has created a vacuum in this sense, that there is no institutional site for this kind of coordination and deliberation. And we're moving very far in the direction of deeper centralization and an imposition of conditionalities using states offered poor performance as a good excuse to pursue that line.
Thank you, Yamini. And while I turn to Pinaki to give us his views on what he thinks the Finance Commission's, whether it's right to impose these conditionalities at all. And also, I would like you to think about what is good and what is bad. Should it be left to the states, or should the center impose its conditions? And also, Yamini, the thought that while you were talking, is that we always talk about the center in every other context, but when it comes to the budget alone, we say union budget. And actually, that's how the Constitution says that India, that is Bharat, is a union of states. So it is very interesting that only in the context of the budget do we call it a union, and everywhere else we refer to it as a center, which somehow gives the impression that is numero uno, and the states are somehow subsidiary. But let me ask you what your thoughts on that subsequently. But meanwhile, if Pinaki can just tell us, should the Finance Commission impose these conditionalities at all? Pinaki.
Yeah, thank you. I think on conditionality, there are 2-3 important considerations. One is the macro number. And if we look at the macro number and the data of transfers to the states after the 14th Finance Commission Award, and the same share of tax devolution continues in the case of 15th also, the unconditional transfer is around 70% of the total transfers. So the money that goes as conditional grants, that is around 30% of the total transfers. Now, whether it should be 30 or less or more is something that's a matter of judgment. And also, what are the national priorities? The center think it should intervene in state areas. So areas that are in the functional domain of states. So, and there the argument is that you should do, as Nishant pointed out, I think you should do which has got externalities. So if there are cross-state externalities, certainly that should be done by the center, because state won't have interest in such expenditures. And so that is where the consolidation of CSS comes in. But in overall macro number, if you look at, the large part of the money goes as untied transfer to the state through the tax devolution. And I also wanted to inform that this structure hasn't changed if we look at both 14th and the 15th Finance Commission's report. On the question of center versus union, I think it's a very interesting question. I think it's union of states, and if we look at our expenditure, 2/3 of the expenditure, if we take out the social sector expenditure or aggregate expenditure, is at the state level. So historically, so the point here is that though we talk about quasi-federal system, center, and all the time we don't talk about union, but I think it's a highly decentralized federal system, and when 2/3 of the expenditure is happening at the state level, so reform in CSS is very different than centralization. I think there are two issues to it. One, we need to reform CSS. And at the same time, we probably don't need one size fits all CSS in the entire country. So you may need a CSS, which is very important for Bihar, but you need a very different kind of CSS in Kerala. So those kind of flexibilities in design are some of the important issues that we need to discuss. Probably that is where the CSS reform should happen, apart from reducing the volume. That's my take on centralization and decentralization.
Okay, thank you, Pinaki. In fact, I have another question on the precise issue of centralization and decentralization. And this is from Subhama Bhattacharjee. And I'm sure it's going to set the cat amongst the pigeons among all of you over there. He says the Tamil Nadu finance minister has actually suggested decentralization of direct tax collections. Why only GST? Why only indirect tax? What is the panel's response? Can we do something like that? The US does have it. Can India do it? Pinaki, let me ask you first, and then maybe I'll turn the floor over to the other participants.
Well, it's a very interesting question, but agricultural income states can tax. And states haven't taxed agricultural income. So now if we say that the income tax power, we should have, different income tax rate across the country, I think it's a very complicated issue. I don't have yes or no answer, but its negative implication will be it will have huge tax-induced migration of people from lower tax region to the higher tax region to the lower tax region, and that is one of the reasons why it is kept at the central level. So there were discussions about states piggybacking on income tax, etc. I think these issues need to be examined. There is no clear yes or no answer.
Oh, absolutely. You might see more such migrations. In fact, you might see some of the people shifting out of Bombay to God knows where they would like to go. Perhaps some of the other states would offer, concessional taxes. But let me see if there's any of the other panelists, would they like to take a try at this?
Sorry.
Decentralization of direct tax collections. Yes, Nishant.
No, not on this, because this I agree with Pinaki. I think this is you don't want, with direct taxes, you don't want a race to the bottom. I don't think even if you allowed Indian states to tax, given the disparity in the economic activity and the kind of economic activity, no state will tax. Because the ones who, if they start taxing, you have a problem. Right? Because most states can't tax, they anyway lose people if they don't want to lose more. And the ones who receive them wouldn't want to tax because they don't want to lose out to the other states. So I think there is a race to the bottom. Even if you allow them to tax it, it won't happen.
So Mythili,
yeah, sure.
Sorry. Okay. So very quickly, we just talked about that tax collection is limited, whether the center does it or the states do it. And we talked about the need to collect, meanwhile, until this ratio picks up and it moves very slowly, non-tax revenues, which means privatization. And I wonder whether this is something that the state should be doing more. Privatizing the assets owned by the states. A second quick thing is, Mythili, you may remember that you anchored this show at NCER, where Tamil Nadu's finance minister raised this point. So maybe you have a better answer to the question than any of us.
Mythili, can I come in?
Yeah, sure, please, Yamini, come in.
Thanks. No, I think you have set the cat amongst the pigeons. And I broadly agree with both Pinaki and Nishant on the question of direct taxes, and particularly the issue of regional imbalances, which is going to create a problem. But I think this also highlights both what Pinaki mentioned, agricultural taxes, Poonam talked about asset monetization. This also raises a very important issue on the centralization, decentralization tug of war. And I want to say two things here that relate to the earlier discussion that we had as well. One is that at a very foundational, fundamental level, I do not think that there is a consensus in India about what level of function should be performed at what level of function, at what level of government. And as a consequence, you end up having a lot of overlap between what the center should do and what the states should do. Sometimes this creates a happy consensus. When things were good, states used centrally sponsored schemes to substitute for wages, which were coming out of their pockets. And when things are bad, states find themselves with a big fiscal hole, particularly because a large amount of expenditure that is not core wages and liabilities for all of these social sector expenditures, a large part of which is actually what states spend on, comes out of centrally sponsored scheme budgets. And you want the money, but you don't, but you also don't want it to impose on you. And when the money starts getting reduced, it does have a significant impact on the state's budgets. The problem is that there isn't a site or space for negotiation and discussion. The National Development Council, with those 5-year plans, I'm not advocating to go back to it. Those were deeply problematic and deeply centralizing, but the absence of it creates a lot of unpredictability, a lot of uncertainty. It also allows for a very easy blame game. I'm not spending on health and education at the state level because the center is not giving me money. Center will say I'm not allocating money because it is for the states to do, and you end up creating a political economy context in which accountability and blame can be pushed back and forth, and we see that football taking place consistently. The center has also indulged, even though tax devolution, as Pinaki rightly pointed out, is a larger proportion of money that goes to states, which is completely untied. Let us not forget that the center has over time started this practice of using cesses and surcharges to reduce what is in the divisible pool as a proportion of total taxes available, as a consequence of which and partly because of the center's own inability to raise revenues at the level at which the center wants to raise revenues to be able to continue with a lot of its expenditure. So that again creates a context in which you break down, the availability of total resources reduces, and you open up the space for this centralization, decentralization, tug of war narrative. And each of these are complex issues, but they do need to be discussed and debated in the context of our overall public finance management system and public finance reforms. And it addresses all, and it links to the macro fiscal consequences of centrally sponsored schemes that Pinaki was talking about. In an ideal world, the center should identify broadly what are national goals. And then, as Pinaki and I were discussing on the side, this should be devolved to states. Let states figure it out and let the state's political economy work this through, rather than the center deciding line item by line item where you should build a school and where you should build a health center. Two last points while I have the floor, because I know we are running out of time. One, on education, I think, Nishant, I do disagree with you on that on two counts. One, right now, at this moment in time, we have seen a large push of students away from private schooling back into government schooling. The so-called expansion of the school education budget under Samagra Shiksha is primarily going for online schooling. Children are hopefully coming back to school after 2 years, hopefully without any breaks. There's going to be a huge input required for remedial training, which will not come from One Nation, One TV. It will come from actual teacher-student interaction. Vacancies need to be filled. Remedial training and teaching needs to happen. This needs serious investment. We can't take this as lightly as we are. The long-term consequences of this on our economy are going to be significant. We have ignored this problem, and that's a huge hole in our response to the pandemic. On NREGA, I think it's important.
Yamini, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Because I think we're almost at the end of time, and I just do want to ask Nishant one question, because he's the only panelist who's got away without any audience questions so far. So this is the last question to the panelists, and this is from Inamul Haq and it's addressed to Nishant. He says, does the budget address the issue of employment as claimed by the government in various post-budget briefings? Nishant.
Sorry, what was the question? This is the issue of?
Nishant, see, you clearly thought you were going to get away without any questions, but there is a question addressed to you.
I missed the key word in the question. Sorry, get away with that.
This is from Inamul Haq, who's from Business Kashmir. He says, does the budget address the issue of employment as claimed by the budget by the government in all its post-budget conferences? Does it address the issue of employment? Very quickly, because we only have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, well, so I give the easy answer first. I think that if you increase any kind of expenditure in the budget, capital or revenue in the way they have, then you are going to create some direct jobs. And actually, again, I will repeat the fact that construction is now one of the only activities that has, in India, still has low productivity, which means that if you spend 1 rupee on capital, you still spend a substantial amount on hiring labor. You don't do that in manufacturing anymore, and we certainly don't do that in services. So that expansion is going to create some direct jobs in the near future. Again, that depends on what we are able to spend, right? I'm not commenting on that. I'm commenting on the budget. If it says we will spend 1 lakh crores, then I think they were going to create some jobs. I think the problem of long run jobs, I am going to repeat, and here I do agree with Yamini. I don't think the problem of long run jobs or employment issues can be addressed through a budget. If you look, India doesn't have actually information to do this work. But if you look at what has happened over the last 20 years of automation in the first wave, and then there was, with computers, and now with AI, the second wave, what happens in most developed economies is you lose the mid-level jobs, right? So you have a lot of low-end jobs and you have a lot of high-end jobs, and you lose the mid-level jobs. That's going to happen here as well. That's going to happen at the high end. And we anyway are not creating jobs at the low end, right? You can see what is happening where if you have used over 2020 and 2021, if you used to interact with a live person on customer support, you now do it with either a chatbot or you do it with an automated AI system. So we are already seeing a lot of these things, changes taking place, and they will keep taking place. So it cannot be addressed in a budget, but I do agree with Yamini that there is a lot of movement back towards government schools. Unfortunately, we don't know how much that is. I wish we had the informational reason. DICE is there, but we don't collect the data in real time. I don't know why DICE is about 2 years old. It's an automated system. It's supposed to collect information today.
Absolutely. We're always struggling.
Data is not very useful, right? So
absolutely. Yes. I would love to give all of you a last, minute to wrap up your discussions and your points of view, but I'm afraid we've run out of time completely. All good things must come to an end. And we've actually run out of time, something I did not think was possible when I was told that the time was 2 hours. So let me thank all our panelists, Yamini, Poonam, Pinaki, Deepak and Nishant, and all those who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this a success. And last but not the least, a very lively, enthusiastic audience who participated. In fact, I have so many questions that I still have not been able to throw at you, but maybe they can address these to you directly if you don't mind. Thank you once again very much to all of you, and a good night to all of you on a weekday. I don't think it's fair to keep anybody beyond 8 o'clock. Thank you very much once again.